from opposition, I said that I couldn't envisage a circumstance where after you had a once-in-a-century global pandemic and an extraordinary response with the largest economic stimulus that we've ever seen at any time in Australia, that you would just move on and not have an examination of what went well, how things could be improved. It is beyond doubt that you will need an assessment. Whether that be a Royal Commission or some form of inquiry, that will need to happen.
Are you going to call a Royal Commission into this so Australians know exactly what was going on?
I've said consistently that once we were through the pandemic, it would be inconceivable, regardless of who won the election in May, that you would not have a proper examination of the circumstances around the handling of the pandemic.
Now, more recently, Anthony Albanese has been evasive on this issue and in some instances has backtracked, which, whatever way you dice it, would amount to a broken promise. Is it too early to say this? Well, whilst we wait for Parliament to start live today, did you know that Senator Babet on Monday introduced another bill in Parliament in the Senate calling on Anthony Albanese and his government to make good on his promise to hold a Royal Commission into the pandemic response? To bring you up to speed, let's have a quick look at that.
Senator Babet, can I ask you to move your motion, please?
Yes. I move the motion. Thank you. Now, it's been almost a year, like I was saying, almost a year since the Prime Minister, Mr Albanese, promised to establish a Royal Commission into our nation's pandemic response. Almost a year. Where is our Royal Commission? Now, I know things move slowly in this place, but the Prime Minister promised this in August last year. He said a Royal Commission or something equivalent would be set up, and I'll quote him here. He said, as soon as practicable. Now, when might as soon as practicable be, Prime Minister? How long are we going to have to wait?
Now, to reinforce the point here, that was Monday just past, Monday the 7th of August, where there was much debate on that particular bill, with the outcome being a division, where after the ayes and the nays were counted, it was a tie, 29 to 29. And that means that the bill didn't get up. And I will show you clearly that the Labor Albanese government used its numbers to block this motion. If that's not a lead up to a broken promise, then I'm really not sure how best to describe that. But let's just have a little quick look at some background leading up to this.
Senator Hanson.
Well, I rise to speak in support of Senator Babet's motion. Since before the federal election, it's been One Nation's policy to have a Royal Commission into the management of the COVID-19 pandemic by Australian governments. The matter has become more urgent.
Senator Antic.
Acting Deputy President, I too support this motion and believe that we need a Royal Commission into COVID. I'd also like a Senate inquiry into COVID as well, but anyway, I'll take whatever I can get at this stage, because there are a number of issues that need to be addressed in this. And
Senator Canavan.
Acting Deputy President, well, we need a Royal Commission right away because people are still dying and we don't know why. That's the fundamental reason we should have this inquiry sooner rather than later. The statistics don't lie. We've got, unfortunately, tragically, deaths in this country running at levels we've never seen before outside of war. Deaths, or so-called excess deaths, the number of deaths above which is expected, given the age structure and history of fatality in this country, is running at, it has been running at 15% and even higher than on average. And worse, no one can tell us why. Many of myself and other colleagues have asked the Department of Health in Senate estimates, and they don't have any answers.
Senator Antic.
Thank you, Chair, and I rise too to speak in support of Senator Babet's matter of public importance seeking a Royal Commission, because in 2020 and 2021, anyone who questioned or criticised the lockdowns in this country was called an anti-vaxxer and a threat to public health. But I mean, I've noticed since those days that there are members of the public, members of Parliament, media commentators, many of them over here, by the way, who Senator Antic did now seek to duck and weave and have forgotten all about that. They've gone rather quiet on the subject, and we want to know what's happened. Well, I'll tell you what's happened. What's happened is the truth has caught up to them. The lockdown narrative has become absolutely indefensible, as has the damage through job losses, through tragic suicides, divorces, increase in health problems. They've all become more evident. And the time will come when every single aspect of the COVID narrative, including the vaccine mandates, the mask mandates, staying 1.5 metres apart, remember that? 1.5 metres apart, and so on, will become utterly indefensible. It's a matter of urgency. It's a matter of urgency that we examine now why, as Senator Canavan said, Australia's excess death rates are increasing after the pandemic.
Thank you, Senators. This being an urgency motion, it will come to a vote. So I put the question. Those in support of the UAP urgency motion, say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. I think the ayes have it.
Noes have it.
Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.
Order, lock the doors. So the question is that the urgency motion is moved by Senator Babet be agreed to. The ayes shall move to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint Senator O'Sullivan as teller for the ayes and Senator Pratt as teller for the noes. Order. There being 28 ayes and 29 noes, the matter is resolved in the negative.
Now, I'm just going to cut back through because I can just see, I'm just bringing you up here. They're just doing the welcome to countries, I guess, and preliminaries. So I'm just going to keep an eye on that. What I did want to say is that had Monday's bill got up, then Anthony Albanese would have had no option at all but to make good on his election promise to the Australian people and call either a Senate inquiry or call a Royal Commission. And I would argue, as many would, that the Royal Commission, which has the powers to compel bureaucrats and those in government on either side of government to provide documents and give answers. And if you're wanting an example of the power of a Royal Commission, you only just need to have a look at the recent Royal Commission into the robo-debt inquiry to see why, if there is to be any inquiry, it really should be a Royal Commission. Now, the talk from Anthony Albanese pre-elect that he was selling to the Australian people that it would be remiss of him to actually not look at that. Now, there was a Labor senator who actually spoke against Ralph Babet's bills on Monday, and that was Marielle Smith from South Australia, one of Anthony Albanese's senators speaking on that particular motion. And I'm just going to bring you, whilst I'm waiting for the debate to come back, I'm just going to bring you a little bit more of what she said.
Senator Smith, M.
Marielle. Thank you, Acting Deputy President. From the outset, can I just say it remains the position of the Albanese government that given the enormous dislocation, stress, death and expenditure involved in the COVID-19 pandemic, it would be extraordinary not to have an inquiry into it. No one is walking away from that position that there is a need for an inquiry. We said that before the election. We have said it since, and that remains our position. But to be clear, we are not yet through the COVID pandemic. It continues. Cases, hospitalisations and deaths related to COVID-19 continue. Maybe at a lower rate, but the pandemic is continuing.
You have committed to some kind of inquiry, like a Royal Commission into Australia's handling of COVID, but there was nothing on this in the budget. When do you plan on calling one?
COVID is still amongst us. And what I've said is that when we are confident that we're through those issues, then we'll examine it.
According to the Labor government, Australia is not through the COVID pandemic. Now, I find that of particular interest given that Anthony Albanese seems to look to the World Health Organization for guidance, and the WHO and the head of the WHO, the fear-mongering and pandemic propaganda talking head, actually said this about the COVID pandemic. Let's have a look.
It's therefore with great hope that I declare COVID-19 over as a global health emergency.
According to the WHO, the pandemic is over, but Anthony Albanese is using that as a means to not honour his election commitment. Now, many might say that it is too early to say that he's not going ahead with that, but you need to, I guess, put this information out, you be the judge, and see what you think of this. And I'm just going to come back and try and pick up. I am monitoring sort of 3 different streams here with comments.
I call the clerk.
Private Senators' Bills ordered the day number 50, Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Amendment Vaccine Indemnity Bill 2023, resumption of second reading debate.
Thank you. Now, I would like to acknowledge the people of Australia whom we in this place are elected to represent to the best of our abilities. To a large extent, their health and their welfare rests in our hands. We must serve them first, rise above the influence of powerful corporate agendas. That's what we must do. Now, today, I introduce to this place a bill that truly serves all Australians. This bill is titled the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Vaccine Indemnity Bill 2023. This is a bill that I should not have to introduce. This bill, if passed by those in this place, will ensure that no future indemnities are granted by the Commonwealth to the manufacturers of vaccines in relation to the use of said vaccines. This bill will limit financial and legal risk to the Commonwealth and aid in the restoration of trust in medicine. Now, over recent years, our elected members have unfortunately undermined the trust of many citizens. Secret deals have been done with pharmaceutical companies. Now, we don't know the details of these deals because, unfortunately, transparency does not exist. What we do know is that a key part of the contract signed with these big companies, these pharmaceutical companies, was an indemnity clause. That's what was in there. Now, the Oxford Dictionary defines indemnity as, and I'll quote, protection against damage or loss, especially in the form of a promise to pay for any damage or loss that happens, end quote. I guess it's easier to sign a blank cheque when you just know it's only taxpayer money that is at stake. This is nothing short of betrayal. Now, the federal budget for 23-24 contained multiple unquantifiable contingent liabilities relating to vaccines. The unquantifiable liability stems from the fact that indemnity has been granted for the advanced purchasing agreement for COVID-19 vaccines. It was a pandemic. We had no other choice. That's what they will say. But before the Australian people accept this excuse, just hear me out for a second. The potential liability doesn't end here. Now, according to the 23-24 budget papers, indemnity has also been granted in advance to a manufacturer of a smallpox and monkeypox vaccine and a particular manufacturer of pandemic and pre-pandemic influenza vaccines. This bill, as designed, does not impinge on existing contracts, but the issue of retrospectivity is something that we should investigate further should this bill be referred to committee. Now, precedent has been set. The pharmaceutical industry has a taste of your money. And they will not stop demanding indemnity unless we in this place say enough. Now, indemnification, it has created an incentive for risk-taking in the pharmaceutical industry, which is not aligned with the fundamental principles of medicine. Where indemnity exists, it is human nature to take larger risks, whether it be conscious or subconscious. The outcomes, they will always be poor. Now, companies work for shareholders first, and it is profits that motivate their decisions and their actions. Our nation, we have granted indemnity to a pharmaceutical company who is famous for setting a world record. Unfortunately, it is not the kind of record that one would boast about. In 2009, Pfizer forked out $2.3 billion for illegal promotion and false and misleading claims about drug safety and paying kickbacks to doctors. This included the largest ever US criminal fine at $1.2 billion. Pfizer was also connected to the death and permanent disability of children who participated in a clinical trial in Nigeria. We also granted indemnity to Moderna, a company which has been trading for 10 years, but until the COVID-19 vaccine had never achieved a single product approval. Contracts known to include indemnity clauses with pharmaceutical companies have been requested as recently as the 22nd of November by the Australian Senate, but unfortunately the government voted against public disclosure of these critical documents. Now, the unjustified suppression of contracts in the public interest is another key driver of this important bill. Now, transparency builds trust. How can the Australian people trust their government in the absence of transparency? The only solution to ensure accountability is by passing this bill. Now, accountability is, after all, a cornerstone of our society. Businesses who produce goods or provide services are expected to be accountable for any adverse or unintended consequences of their product or service. When a product is faulty, for example, it is replaced. When a service is inferior, a refund is provided. Unfortunately, there are large and powerful entities in the pharmaceutical industry who have managed to evade accountability, and it is our federal government who has willingly surrendered the Australian people's right to financially hold them to account. Now, for a vaccine to be available in Australia, it must be approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. The main process for distributing vaccines in Australia is through the National Immunisation Program, NIP. Section 9B of the National Health Act 1953 allows the Minister for Health to provide or arrange for the provision of vaccines for distribution through the NIP. Vaccines distributed via the NIP must all be listed on the PBS. The purchase of vaccines occurs through the Commonwealth entering into supply arrangements, aka contracts, with the relevant pharmaceutical companies. These arrangements would include the amount of compensation the Commonwealth is liable to pay in exchange for the vaccines and are generally subject to the Commonwealth procurement rules. The process for the purchasing of the COVID-19 vaccines varied from the normal process for purchasing vaccines for distribution through the NIP. While the Commonwealth Government has previously provided indemnities for vaccine manufacturers, this only appears to have occurred in limited circumstances. Indemnities provided to vaccine manufacturers and sponsors have become more commonplace during and post the COVID-19 pandemic. But very little is known by the general population about the specifics of said indemnities, as the contracts between government and corporations have been protected as commercial in confidence. When transparency and accountability measures are removed from government contracts, a threat emerges and the likelihood of errors, omissions, and nefarious actions emerge. The trust in both medicine and government is threatened by the weakening of accountability measures. The Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act 2013 enables a finance minister or their delegate to grant indemnities on behalf of the Commonwealth. Indemnities given by the Commonwealth create contingent liabilities. In other words, they may give rise to a liability on the occurrence of a future event. To achieve its objective, this bill amends the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act 2013. The Act establishes the framework for government financial accountability arrangements and includes provisions enabling the Finance Minister or their delegate to grant indemnities on behalf of the Commonwealth. This bill inserts a new section 61A into the PGPA Act. To my colleagues in this chamber, I want you to think for a second and consider this in your personal life. Let's just say that you're negotiating with a builder to construct a new home for your family. You complete your plans, specifications and selections of your floor coverings, doorknobs and taps, etc. The time comes to sign the build contract. You read through the contract, it all seems fine, but then you get to the term sheet and you see the total cost for your new home. You don't see a number, you see a word, unquantifiable. How many of you would sign that contract? Probably not many of you, if any. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said when you are signing a contract on behalf of Australian taxpayers. You are more than willing to write a blank cheque on behalf of other people, but you probably wouldn't do it for yourself. That's why I have put up this bill. I urge you to support it, and I urge you to treat taxpayer money the same as you would treat your own money. Our state and its elected representatives appear to have been captured, and it is an ongoing problem. The bill serves multiple purposes. It's not just the limiting of financial and legal risks to the Commonwealth. As a good global citizen, it is also worth noting the potential for state capture that arises because of indemnity clauses in vaccine contracts. Published in the Journal of Pharmaceutical Policy and Practice is a research paper titled State Capture through Indemnification Demands, Effects on Equity in the Global Distribution of COVID-19 Vaccines. This paper concludes that COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers' indemnification demands constitute state capture in many low and middle income countries. In global pandemics, pharmaceutical companies can exert their power and coerce nations to shift their laws or policies away from the public good and towards the demands of pharmaceutical companies. Wealthy nations like Australia are more capable of meeting the indemnification demands of private companies, resulting in delayed access to vaccines for lower income nations. Indemnification has also had the unintended consequence of enhancing global vaccine inequities. The fact is that the COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out with the support of an indemnity clause. These vaccines have unfortunately resulted in over 139,000 adverse event reports, and some people have died. Based on the recent West Australian data from 2021, the COVID-19 vaccine had an adverse event reporting rate that is 23 times greater per dose than non-COVID-19 vaccines. There were 264 adverse events per 100,000 doses when compared to just 11 for non-COVID-19 vaccines. This is obviously unacceptable, and big pharmaceutical companies, they just appear to be unaccountable and, quite frankly, a little bit untouchable at the moment. This bill has been drafted in a very reasonable manner. It honours existing commercial contracts. We just cannot undo the past. But what we can do is we can ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. We must draw a line in the sand and regain our sovereignty over vaccine contracts, over big pharmaceutical companies. The question of whether this bill is supported or not will be a test of all of us here in this place. Do you represent the people of Australia, or will you, in my opinion, just sell out to these big pharma corporations? Please support this bill and help me in restoring our nation's trust in medicine and holding these giant global corporations to account. Thank you.
Senator Antic.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak in support of this bill. And in 2021, just 2 short years ago, the COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out to the Australian population. Now, supposedly this was done to protect us from coronavirus, which had a case fatality rate of 0.16%. and for which the average fatality age was 86, which was the same age as the regular seasonal flu. And of course, by rolled out, I mean that the vaccines were mandated by government departments such as in the health sector, the education sector and so on, as well as in the private workplaces. Major pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer and Moderna swiftly developed products to stop the spread. The COVID vaccines were developed far more quickly than the usual decade or so it takes to develop a vaccine, and they did it in way less than 2 years. Their products were swiftly granted provisional approval by the Therapeutic Goods Association and other regulators around the world. The manufacturers of these vaccines were granted indemnities from government, meaning that the companies themselves could effectively offload liability of their newly developed products to the taxpayer. Personally, I think the fact that these big pharma companies sought such indemnities in the first place suggests to us that those products may not be as safe and effective as our health departments wanted us to believe. And indeed, this was a giant red flag for many Australians. Many Australians were told that they had to take 2 doses of this quickly developed pharmaceutical product, which the manufacturers would then face no legal or financial consequences for should they prove defective or lose their job. The recipient took all the risk, and this was justified by government departments and the media because we needed to stop the spread. I've always maintained that vaccine mandates were unjust. To me, that was just a matter of common sense and principle. It seems obvious that the government doesn't have the right to determine what any one human being puts into their body, and getting vaccinated with any kind of vaccine is, of course, an irreversible treatment. If it turns out to be defective, you can't undo the decision. You must live with the consequences. But pharmaceutical companies won't have to. You will. Throughout that period, if one ignored the public health advice and the ludicrous media hysteria, the situation wasn't complicated. It was a matter of principle. And as a result, many Australians opted not to receive a novel vaccine and waited to see what would happen. The indemnities granted to pharmaceutical companies were one of the many factors that rightly sparked suspicion. Had mandates not been in place, far fewer people would have received a dose at all, in my view. As time passed, it became clear why Big Pharma wanted these indemnities in the first place, because their products were not safe and they were not effective. They did not prevent people from contracting COVID, meaning they didn't stop the spread as promised. They didn't prevent hospitalisation, and the notion that they reduced hospitalisation, a line often touted by those who are desperate to defend the decision in the first place, is absurd given that the rates of adverse effects we're seeing now. Anecdotally speaking, many people know at least one person who had an adverse event, and that wouldn't be considered minor, ranging from cardiac complications to neurological symptoms to dying suddenly, tragically. There's a lot of vaccine regret out there, I can assure you. Meanwhile, the unvaccinated in our midst seem to be doing fine, and I'm not aware of any one single unvaccinated person who's developed myocarditis or the so-called long COVID. I recently spoke with a young Adelaide woman by the name of Hannah who developed a severe cardiac condition after her second dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. Her condition has permanently changed her life. And whereas it's almost certain that had she simply caught COVID, she would have been perfectly fine. And in fact, she was lucky to even have her condition acknowledged as being the result of a vaccine, though thankfully it eventually was. No doubt there are countless others out there who are injured, but their injury has not been acknowledged as such, given doctors face suspension for contradicting AHPRA and the TGA's position. And 9 months ago, in a hearing before the European Parliament, a Pfizer representative admitted that Pfizer didn't know whether their product would stop viral transmission before it was rolled out around the world. Remember stopping the spread? And that was the entire basis for the mandates in this country. People were told it was their moral obligation to roll up their sleeves and get the jab to save grandma. Shouldn't Pfizer have said something? They knew their product wouldn't stop transmission. I think we all know they should have. 2009 press release from the United States Department of Justice titled "Justice Department Announces Largest Healthcare Fraud Settlement in History" reads as follows, and I quote, "American pharmaceutical giant Pfizer Incorporated agreed to pay $2.3 billion, the largest healthcare fraud settlement in the history of the Department of Justice, to resolve criminal and civil liability arising from the illegal promotion of certain pharmaceutical products," the Justice Department announced today. Pfizer has agreed to plead guilty to the felony violation of the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act for misbranding Bextra with the intent to fraud or mislead. Pfizer promoted the sale of Bexa for several uses and dosages that the FDA specifically declined to provide approval for due to safety concerns. The company will pay a criminal fine of $1.195 billion, the largest criminal fine ever imposed in the United States for any matter. And it goes on, but you get the point. Pfizer paid what at the time was the largest criminal fine in US history. That's criminal fine, not a fine for simple negligence, but for deliberate fraud. Pfizer promoted their drugs as having health outcomes they didn't have, and as being made for conditions they were not approved for, putting users of their products at risk. However, nobody from Pfizer ever faced any real punishment for their actions. They can just factor those fines into the budget line of hundreds of billions of dollars and continuing to donate to major media outlets and move on. The COVID emergency was the perfect opportunity. In 2022, Pfizer enjoyed a record $100 billion in sales. These companies can afford the hit their reputation takes, and they still make a profit in the end. It's absurd and unjust that Australians were coerced and pressured into taking these products while the manufacturers were indemnified by the government, and therefore you and I. Some other members of the Parliament have sought to have the agreement between, along with myself, have sought to have the agreement between pharmaceutical companies and the government disclosed to the public, but that motion was voted down by Labor and the Greens, the great champions of transparency, because they don't want transparency after all. Furthermore, as I and others have spoken about in this chamber before, there's been a massive increase in excess death rates, not only in Australia, but across the world after the vaccines were distributed. I think it's quite reasonable to suspect that the drastic increase in death rates, which was 15.3% throughout 2022 in Australia, is being driven at least in part by the COVID-19 vaccines. These vaccines are the obvious factor that was not present before 2021 when the increase in deaths began, yet the major pharmaceutical companies face absolutely no scrutiny on the issue. Given what we're hearing from the World Health Organization, there's going to be future pandemics to prepare for. So let's prevent those pharmaceutical companies from developing more products for use on the Australian population. Removing the option of indemnities means they won't be able to get away with developing drugs such as these poor-performing drugs with no financial consequences, at least not as easily. Big Pharma must face some consequences and bear some responsibility if they end up causing harm to Australians in the event of a future emergency, lest they manipulate and exploit the situation to their own advantage, as, in my view, appears to have been done here. Ideally, I prefer that we simply never, ever, ever have vaccine mandates again, but legislation that would have protected Australians from mandates has also been voted down multiple times in this place because, strangely enough, Labor and the Greens reject the principle of my body, my choice. Throughout COVID, indeed, for many years now, Big Pharma has been generating scandal after scandal, injury after injury, and paying fine after fine, yet never facing any meaningful consequences because they can simply factor their inevitable payouts in as a budget line item. The Australian government and the health departments cannot be beholden to the whims of giant big pharmaceutical companies. There must be an understanding that, as wonderful and effective as some of their products are in treating illness and disease and relieving pain, they are for-profit corporations that have literally paid billions and billions of dollars in criminal fines over the years. These pharmaceutical companies, it seems, were able to strong-arm governments, some governments, into buying ludicrous amounts of their products because it was apparently a major emergency. Governments wanting to get vaccines into the arms of their citizens as quickly as possible awarded indemnities to these companies and deferred any consequences of all of the hasty actions until a later date. And that later date has arrived. And we're now living in the fallout of what from beginning to end was a disaster. People were saying all the things that are now coming to light about the vaccines and lockdowns from the very beginning, and they were utterly vilified for defying the narrative. Don't forget that. We can't allow Big Pharma to exert this kind of leverage and pressure on governments again. We should not be beholden to these companies. They should have severe financial consequences, to say the least, for the products they've made should they turn out to be defective. So I support this bill. I commend Senator Babet for introducing it, and I hope that others, and particularly others in this place that have a history of standing up, so-called, to the Big Pharma companies, and I'm looking at the Australian Greens in particular, live up to what they're talking about and support this bill.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. As a servant to the many different people who make up our one Queensland community, I speak in support of the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Vaccine Indemnity Bill 2023. Because with indemnity comes impunity. And this parliament needs huge doses of accountability to change it from exploiting the people and return it to serving the people. The main process for distributing vaccines in Australia is through the National Immunisation Program. Section 9B of the National Health Act 1953 allows the Minister for Health to provide or arrange for the provision of injections for distribution through the National Immunisation Program. Injections distributed via the National Immunisation Program must be listed on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. The purchase of injections occurs through the Commonwealth entering into supply contracts with the relevant pharmaceutical companies. These arrangements would include the amount of compensation the Commonwealth is liable to pay in exchange for the injections and are generally subject to the Commonwealth procurement rules. During COVID, the Liberal government, with the full support of Labor, opposition and the Greens, simply tore up the rule book. Pfizer was given a blanket immunity, and Pfizer knew when the injection was being developed and tested that they had a blanket immunity. What could go wrong? Firstly, accountability is shredded. The outcome of this ill-considered decision was an excess mortality rate in Australia of 27% above normal since the vaccines were rolled out. Most likely 30,000 Australians will die this year from side effects of our COVID response, including the injectables. Did they really think Pfizer, a multinational pharmaceutical company with an appalling track record, would suddenly turn into a model corporate citizen when asked to produce the COVID injections? Did you? Prior to COVID, Pfizer had been fined $3 billion for criminal acts. Criminal acts. They are a habitual offender, persistently engaging in illegal and corrupt marketing practices, bribing physicians and suppressing adverse trial results. We know Pfizer suppressed bad trial data in the COVID trials, fabricated results, excluded test subjects that became sick and failed to test for a full range of adverse effects. They did this knowingly. The vaccines were then manufactured in a shoddy fashion and did not use good manufacturing process as they were supposed to be, and as every other product approved for Australia in Australia must. Live DNA derived from E. coli used in production has been found to be in large quantities in the Pfizer product, up to 1 billion strands or parts of strands in every dose. Huge variations between batches suggest huge variations in manufacturing quality. I say suggest because we have no idea what is actually in these products, because the TGA accepts batch testing from the manufacturer and has not conducted the testing on each batch as it arrives. It has not conducted the testing. The TGA took the US FDA's word for the results of the stage 2-3 clinical trials, and the FDA took Pfizer's word for it. We're relying on Pfizer's word for these. To give a product immunity, the TGA should have thoroughly tested these injections, not look the other way. We have no idea what harm these products will eventually cause because there was no long-term safety testing conducted. None. Why would they spend that money when they already had the immunity? That's what immunity's done to them. More profit for Pfizer. More money in the pocket for CEO Albert Bourla, who banked $30 million in salary and bonuses last financial year. Overall, Pfizer sold $36 billion in COVID products in 2022, pushing Pfizer to a record $100 billion in sales. I am slightly encouraged to see their share price is down 40% from the peak of 2021, and projected revenue in 2023 is down 80%. While Pfizer made out like the fraudulent bandits they are, the Australian taxpayers are on the hook for who knows how much. The budget papers are required to show every potential liability the government has. There is an entry for our liability under the COVID products, yet they have not quantified it. You have not quantified it. There's no figure there. That can't continue. This liability will run into the billions. Australia needs this bill from Senator Babet to make sure no greedy, dishonest, opportunistic pharmaceutical company is allowed to get away with financial murder again. Australia needs this bill to make sure no inhuman monster, like the former Health Minister Greg Hunt, like the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, like Premiers Palaszczuk, McGowan, Andrews, is ever allowed to get away with misfeasance, forcing experimental gene therapy-based injections, leading to tens of thousands of deaths, tens of thousands of people permanently crippled for life, and hundreds of thousands of people injured, and uncounted people grieving. That's the nuts and bolts. Now we go into the morality, because government cannot be trusted. With immunity comes impunity. The simple reason for lack of accountability is the hiding of government actions through indemnities. Firstly, my position on medications, including injections. We all want safe treatment. We are all pro-medicine. We all want that each of us decides what is put into our body. My body, my choice. We all want freedom to make our choice and for our choice to be accepted and respected. We all wholeheartedly support medicines that are fully tested and proven safe, effective, affordable and accessible. I am opposed to untested drugs, forcing of untested experimental injections onto people, forcing untested experimental injections onto people with the only alternative being to lose one's livelihood or let your children starve. How could any human allow this to happen? How could any human allow this to happen? Yet you did. And then in your shame, your cowardice, your guilt, the best you can do to those of us who stood up to this inhuman, monstrous and at times murderous madness is call us anti-vaxxers. Pathetic. Shame. Labels are the refuge of the ignorant, the incompetent, the dishonest, the guilty and the fearful. Name-calling as you sling words at us for protecting innocent, good people. But your vilification means nothing to us because we go for the truth. I oppose coercion, I oppose mandates, I oppose confidentiality, hiding details from taxpayers. These untested injections from Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca were forced on people using lies. Daily, for 2 weeks, former Prime Minister Morrison said, there are no vaccine mandates in Australia. A lie. A murderous lie, killing 30,000 Australians annually in excess deaths above normal. Worse, the Morrison-Hunt duo enabled and drove the injection mandate. Here's how. Morrison-Hunt duo bought the injections. Morrison-Hunt duo gave them to the states. Morrison-Hunt duo indemnified the states. Morrison-Hunt duo gave Federal Health Department data available to the states. That was the only way the states could enforce their mandates that really were driven by the Morrison-Hunt duo. State premiers admitted their vaccine mandates were in line with the bogus so-called National Cabinet that was headed by Scott Morrison. The Morrison federal government mandated injections in Defence, the Australian Electoral Commission, Aged Care, the Australian Federal Police and others. But there are no vaccine mandates in Australia, he said. And then yesterday on Tuesday I spoke about the Medical Countermeasures Consortium that drove the whole lot. The 4 nations' defence departments from Canada, America, Britain and Australia. This was planned and delivered, and Pfizer did the work on behalf of the American Defence Department. That's why it bypassed all the testing. And now we have 30,000 excess deaths. That's 2 Boeing 787 Dreamliner crashes every week for a year. Every week for a year. And yet we have Queensland nurses still suspended. Still suspended. Foreign nurses are being recruited by Premier Palaszczuk, to take their jobs. And then she tells us repeatedly for the last 3 years, the health system is crashing. Disgraceful. Inhuman. The police are mandated, and they've lost many. The teachers have been mandated. And when they finally lifted the mandate, many of them didn't come back. We found children crippled, affected. The teachers were fined. Doctors were mandated, and many have left the profession. How can Australia put up with that? That's going to hurt the patients. The pilots were mandated, and Civil Aviation Safety Authority, CASA, cares not a bit. It's willfully blind, it's misfeasance, and it's betraying passenger air safety. in a shining light. The Australian Firefighters Association was formed because their union would not stand up for them. Many unions went rogue and did not stand up for their members. The Australian Firefighters Association resisted. They developed from the very start a defensive strategy and an offensive strategy. And that's the only one that Premier Palaszczuk did not mandate. So it's based on false premise. Livelihoods and lives have been destroyed. And we had the absurdity of the drugs failure, the vaccines failure, the injections failure, being falsely blamed on the people who didn't take it. Indemnities encourage impunity and rogue behaviour, irresponsible behaviour, destructive behaviour, cruel, monstrous, inhuman behaviour. Indemnities destroy accountability because everything is hidden and indemnities are given. There's no problem disclosed, and so there's no compensation. Millions of people suffer in silence, and this Labor government perpetuates the misery, the deceit. Rapper Zubi, in a very well-delivered address in 2022 at the CPAC conference, observed that most politicians don't care if people die, and he is correct. Most politicians don't care if people die. There's no Royal Commission, there's no Senate inquiry, there's no access to contracts, commercial in confidence, we're told. Years after they were signed, there's still commercial in confidence. Taxpayers paid for injections, yet we cannot see what we paid for. We can't even see how much we paid. Censorship. What are they hiding? Bill Gates paid for censorship in the mouthpiece Big Brother media that is often owned by the same people that own Pfizer. Bill Gates paid for censorship across social media. Gates is an investor in Big Pharma, a massive investor in Big Pharma, and a massive contributor to the World Health Organization, the UN's World Health Organization. I hold the whole Senate accountable. The whole Senate, apart from 6 senators withstanding the catcalls. At last Thursday's Senate inquiry into anti-discrimination bills, one of which was moved by Senator Hanson, another one by Senator Canavan, Senator Antic and Senator Rennick, 4 of the 5 senators grilling Pfizer, Moderna and the TGA are from Queensland. 4, plus Senator Antic. And Pfizer did not know where to go. Clearly, Pfizer, Moderna and the TGA all disgraced themselves and showed themselves to be inhuman. Clearly, none feel accountable for the deaths, the chronic and crippling injuries, the severe injuries. Not federal government or its health departments, not the state premiers or health departments, not employers mandating injections. No one takes accountability. Well, we will chase you until you are held accountable. We've had airline employees taken to hospital and then returned and insisted, the company Qantas insisted they be injected. There are too many other stories there, I won't go into them. But we see people awakening. We see the situation that's created heroes. Hoodie, Maria Z, Chris Spicer, and many, many more from the independent People's Media. Doctors who formed the Australian Medical Professionals Society. Dr. William Bay, and he is a doctor. Nurses like Dee, fireys like Dan, police like Crystal, paramedics like Peter, doctors like Carmelo, pilots like Alan, and thousands of construction workers and other workers. You've woken the people up. Thank you so much for being our heroes. Here and globally, you're waking people up. When indemnities are granted, especially in secret, accountability is removed. And you in this Senate, in this Parliament, have demonstrated that repeatedly. You've confirmed it. All who oppose this bill will be voting to continue the needless deaths and lies. This bill will prevent recurrence. Ending indemnity will end impunity, will contribute to restoring accountability. Transparency restores trust. I wholeheartedly support this bill and urge all senators to support and to vote in support.
Yeah. Senator Watt.
Thanks, Acting Deputy President. The government will not support this bill. The ability to indemnify vaccine manufacturers in an emergency and/or pandemic situation is critical to secure timely access to vaccines for Australia. This was the case during COVID-19, where our ability to indemnify COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers enabled timely access to vaccines. If the Commonwealth was not able to indemnify COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers, there would have been significant delays or refusal from the manufacturers to supply their vaccine in Australia. If this bill were to pass, this change would hinder Australia's ability to secure timely supply to vaccines during worldwide pandemics. Just by way of background, the Australian government has entered into 5 separate agreements for the supply of COVID-19 vaccines. These include agreements with Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Novavax, Moderna and the COVAX facility for over 250 million doses of vaccine. The agreements with AstraZeneca and COVAX have been fulfilled. The details of advance purchase agreements with pharmaceutical companies for the purchase of COVID-19 vaccines are commercial in confidence. The proposed amendment would apply only in relation to the granting of indemnities on or after the day the amendment commences, so should not impact on any indemnities already granted. The government separately established the COVID-19 vaccine claims scheme to provide an avenue for those who suffered a serious adverse reaction to the COVID-19 vaccine to apply for compensation. The scheme is a no-fault scheme administered by Services Australia that allows claimants to access compensation for injuries resulting from diagnosed clinical conditions likely to be caused by a Therapeutic Goods Administration approved COVID-19 vaccine or its administration. Decisions about which conditions are eligible under the scheme are made based on the advice of the TGA on conditions with a recognised link to the vaccine and include consideration of the events listed in the approved Australian product information for the specific COVID-19 vaccine and the clinical significance of the condition. The TGA closely monitors the safety of COVID-19 vaccines and has a well-established and robust system in place to capture reports of suspected adverse effects of all medicines, including the COVID-19 vaccines. The TGA receives reports of adverse reactions from consumers, health professionals, pharmaceutical companies and state and territory health departments. But as I say, the government will not be supporting this bill, primarily because the ability to indemnify vaccine manufacturers in an emergency and or pandemic situation is critical to secure timely access to vaccines for Australia.
Senator Canavan.
President, well, the government's justification for not supporting this bill does not stack up at all. Does not stack up at all. The argument we just heard from Minister Watt is that somehow we needed a ministerial approval for an indemnity to respond in an emergency to a pandemic. He didn't. He failed to in any way actually outline the timeline of this emergency and apparently how urgent it was. Keep in mind, Madam Deputy President, we did not have this vaccine for almost a year after the pandemic began in February, March 2020. In fact, it didn't really start getting rolled out in Australia for more than a year after this. And all this bill does is remove one man or one woman's ability to indemnify and affect the whole country through a stroke of a pen. That's what it does. And I support this bill because I don't think that power should be placed in one individual. If a future Australian government wants to provide an indemnity to a large pharmaceutical company, and sometimes, as we heard in Senator Babet's speech, even a small one like Moderna, one without any record at all, if they want to do that, they could have brought legislation to this parliament and have the people's representative debate and inquire whether such an indemnity should be given. They had ample time to do that during the coronavirus pandemic. As I said, more than a year. And almost certainly any future pandemic would play out the same way. A vaccine won't be ready straight away. It'll take time to develop. There's plenty of time to call a parliament and have a proper inquiry on whether an indemnity should be provided. Because I'm not so ideological about this that maybe there are some circumstances with a pandemic where there's a virus killing a fatality rate of 50 or 60%, there's a yellow fever or a smallpox, where maybe we do need to provide something like an indemnity. But it shouldn't be done without proper parliamentary scrutiny and oversight because we've seen so many mistakes done here. This system we've got right now, where we almost provide blank cheques to large companies with, at best, spotted corporate histories is a complete undermining of trust of the Australian people, and it transfers enormous risk to them. Because let's be very clear what an indemnity does. An indemnity doesn't remove the risk. It doesn't take the liability away. All the indemnity does is, through a stroke of a pen of a government minister, transfer that risk, that liability, which should naturally be with the company selling a product, to the people. The people who are the ones who are left picking up the bill. The people are the ones, through these government decisions, that are left with the liability and risk of any pharmaceutical product that gets the benefit of them. That's what happens. So under natural tort law, under natural law, common law that's been established in this place and we take from Britain, a company selling a product is liable if their product is defective. And in fact, generally courts over the years have applied a strict liability test. That is, you do not need to prove intent on behalf of the company. They are responsible for their product. If their product is defective, then you, as a consumer who may have been harmed by that product, have the right to take them to court and seek compensation for it. What these indemnities do, at the very least, and I might come to more of the details, at the very least, these indemnities remove that strict product liability, that natural justice that should be provided in a country of laws like ours to a consumer. They remove that. They do not transfer, get this, right? This is what really bugs me. If a government did want to do that and provide an indemnity to a company, why wouldn't the government take on the liability? Why wouldn't they do that? They could do that. Why wouldn't the minister say, look, if we think we need this company to have an indemnity so it can roll out its product and not be having to bear the risk themselves on a small balance sheet, why doesn't the government take on the risk? If the government was so confident in the safe and effective language they were using about the coronavirus vaccines, why wouldn't they take on that liability? They could do that, and they could let any consumer that ultimately was harmed and could prove such harm in a court of law, they could then sue the government for that liability, for that harm, and still receive compensation. But that's not what your government does. For anybody listening here, they don't do that. They don't take on the risk themselves. They try to present themselves, as we just heard, as angels and saints responding to a pandemic, but they don't take on that risk. They transfer it to you. They transfer that risk to you and your family that may be affected by any defective pharmaceutical products are left to pick up the pieces. And what is worse is the people, you as the people, do not even know what those risks are. We're not even allowed to know, because apparently it's commercial in confidence. I don't know why it's commercial in confidence, because the government doesn't take on any liability. The government doesn't accept any commercial risk here. You, the people, just take on that commercial risk as I just outlined. Don't you deserve to know what risks that your government is imposing on you? Why shouldn't you have that knowledge? Because while definitely, as I've outlined, a large pharmaceutical company is absolved from the product liability risk here through these indemnity agreements, which remain secret and hidden for many decades, as Senator Babet said. Well, I want to know, and if there are any further government contributions on this, and I might ask further questions at an appropriate stage, what I really want to know is what other liabilities are absolved from these companies as well. For example, do the companies still liable for misleading and deceptive conduct? Is that indemnified from them? Because I'm very concerned about not just maybe the defective nature of some of these products that are rushed out under an indemnity blanket and not necessarily properly tested. I'm also concerned about if a company then is also absolved from any risk of any statements it might make publicly about the safe and effective nature or the effectiveness of their product, which again would normally be illegal or be an ability for you to take them to court without such indemnity. So, for example, last week, other senators have mentioned, last week we had finally got Pfizer and Moderna along to a Senate committee. They took a while for us to do that, but we got them along to a Senate committee to answer some questions. And I raised with them the fact that the Pfizer CEO, in fact, and the Pfizer company itself had made a number of public statements early on in their vaccine rollout that their vaccine could stop transmission, that their vaccine was 100% effective against you. In fact, one time, Pfizer said it was their vaccine was 100% effective at stopping you from getting coronavirus. They made that statement. They made that statement. In fairness, they said a study in South Africa has shown that our vaccine is 100% effective against you getting coronavirus. Now, putting aside all the debates about adverse events, I think we could probably all agree that that statement is a big fat lie. That's a massive lie. Anybody here think that the vaccine has stopped them from getting coronavirus? Has that happened? That is just a total lie. It's a total lie from a big corporate entity that potentially, seemingly gone unpunished. I don't know why the ACCC's not onto it. They have said that. It's out there. And when I put to them, you've made that statement, and ever since mid-2021, I could not find a single statement from Pfizer, a professional statement, a Twitter, a tweet or whatever. I could not find one thing from Pfizer which clarified the effectiveness of their vaccine about you getting the coronavirus. Not a single extra thing. Because obviously all the evidence since that time has completely undermined what Pfizer had to say in early and mid-2021. But they have failed at any point since then that I could find, and they couldn't point to any. I think they took it on notice, so we'll wait and see what comes back. But they could not tell us where they have clarified the record to fully inform the customers of their product that perhaps their vaccine it wasn't 100% effective against you getting the coronavirus. So I really want to know here, can I take Pfizer to court for misleading and deceptive conduct? Because it seems like a pretty open and shut case to me here that they have engaged in what any other company in this country would be done for misleading and deceptive conduct is a key part of our consumer law. But are they indemnified against that as well? Can they just say whatever they like about it? Because I think that's very, very important, because we must keep in mind the records of these companies, because sometimes it's almost presented as if they're not really companies, they're somehow modern day saints, all helping us extend our lives. When most of us who have looked at this in any sense of details know that these are some, perhaps, of the most fraudulent companies that have ever graced this God's earth. In fact, Pfizer themselves in 2009, at the time, had to pay the largest settlement to the US Department of Justice in history, or at that time the largest payment, for fraud. A $2.3 billion fine for corporate fraud, and the reason they were in their corporate fraud is they were misrepresenting the approval of certain pharmaceutical products. Obviously these didn't have an indemnity, they weren't vaccines, but certain pharmaceutical products were being misadvertised to American consumers, and they were ultimately fined $2.3 billion. And so these are the companies that we provide a full indemnity to and put that risk on to Australian consumers. This is this is completely beyond the pale here, and there is no justification for the lack of transparency, for the lack of parliamentary oversight, for the lack of oversight from general people that goes into the conclusion of these vaccines. The other point I'd like to make in closing this debate is I think this debate has evolved a lot in a short space of time. I do want to give credit to Senator Babet for bringing this particular bill forward, and also to many of my other colleagues that over the past year and a half, almost 2 years now, have raised these and related issues. Senator Roberts, Senator Hanson, Senator Antic, Senator Rennick. I hope I'm not missing some, but a lot of senators have brought these issues up. And when we first brought them up, I don't know if some of my colleagues remember, when we first brought these issues up, we first brought a bill, I remember, up to end mandates, to end vaccine mandates. We struggled to get a word in because on the other side there were others wanting to jump up and call us anti-vaxxers and how ridiculous, and we were QAnon conspiracists and all these epithets. There was multiple speeches from the other side condemning us as almost evil for even suggesting that somehow the products of the saintly Pfizers or Modernas of the world would be in any way questionable. Well, it's very different today, isn't it? It's very different today. We had a half-hearted attempt there from Minister Watt to rebut this particular bill, but he didn't actually give any real time. I don't think even the word safe and effective didn't, I think, go past his mouth even. People have completely surrendered on this issue, but now the problem is they're too embarrassed to admit their mistakes and they won't correct them on behalf of the Australian people. Well, it's about time some humble pie is eaten on this debate and we actually make decisions in the best interest of the Australian people, not the best interest of trying to protect our parliamentary record or previous statements. Because, as I say, the proof is in the pudding. Who's taking a booster now? Who's getting a booster? Anyone? Anyone want to put their hand up and getting it? I mean, no one's doing this anymore, right? Hardly anyone is doing this. All right, Murray, good on you. Good on you for having the courage. I think the latest stats out of the US show that 12% of people are doing it. 12%. So these ads, and I should say, just on the ads, that I think there's still some ads I see from the Commonwealth Government promoting this vaccine, and not once in these ads they recommend, they refer to the fact there are actually side effects from them. We know that there are cases of myocarditis, pericarditis, other side effects, particularly for young males, and they never mention it in the ads. I mean, it's totally irresponsible. Now, fortunately, I have great faith and trust in the Australian people, and they've worked it out for themselves. They're not listening to the ads because hardly anyone's getting it. But at the very least, the government could be upfront with them and say that, hey, if you're young and fit and healthy, you probably don't need this vaccine. Don't get it. And hardly any young, fit, healthy people are getting it. But it would be good to have full disclosure here because we constantly seem to be trying to dupe the Australian people on these issues when it would be much better just to take them into our faith and explain all of the problems with any particular drug or pharmaceutical product, which are always legion. There's always side effects from pharmaceutical products. So we will keep fighting for this issue, even though it seems the other side have effectively surrendered on this. But we will keep raising these issues on behalf of the Australian people because they've worked it out. They understand what's going on here. They understand the great swindle that these pharmaceutical companies get away with constantly. And as I started my contribution, what should happen here is that any future indemnities are done through full parliamentary oversight and approval, that they bring in legislation to this place. If they want to do that, the government wants to do it. There's plenty of time during a pandemic to do this, as we saw in coronavirus. Don't give us that rubbish that it has to be done overnight. And let's not have these kind of deals done in back rooms through one particular minister at the time that has all the power to impose all the risk of a pharmaceutical product onto you, the people. We will keep fighting for you. And once again, credit for Senator Babet for bringing this forward.
Senator Rennick.
Thank you, Acting Madam Deputy Chair. And I rise today too to speak in favour of this bill. I think it is way overdue, and I think that it's a real shame that this wasn't introduced earlier because too many people have suffered. And what's worse is that the people who have been injured by the vaccine have effectively been gaslighted and haven't got proper compensation to help with their injuries. And to think that we could spend hundreds of billions of dollars on shutting down a country in regards to coronavirus when young people of healthy working age people had very little risk from the virus and yet spend nothing on the same people when they are injured by the vaccine is gross hypocrisy. But before I get into the vaccine, I actually want to talk about this side of the chamber and what the Liberal Party pretends to believe in, or was what we're supposed to believe in, and that is capitalism. And of course, a capitalist is someone who actually risks their own capital. And as I've always said, I don't believe in the free markets, and I'm in good company there because Robert Menzies himself didn't believe in free markets. He said it in a Forgotten People speech. He said we should not go back to the old and selfish notions of laissez-faire. I've spent my whole life working in finance, and I've never seen freedom as a line item on the balance sheet. There's only two outcomes in a market. You're either making money or you're losing money. And the real capitalists out there are the people, the Australians who get out of bed every day and put their nose to the grindstone. And that's, I don't care whether you're a teacher or a nurse or a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer or a scientist. If you're out there busting your gut, or a small business I should add, you're the one risking your capital. And I've always tended to have thought of that in terms of economics, but unfortunately, because of this, contrived crisis that was brought about by state governments who just lost the plot, basically, we've now found that people had to risk their health because of the government mandate, and that is totally wrong. And I think that we need to have a good look at that. because effectively I can tell you who aren't capitalists, and that's big corporations. And they've never been capitalists because they've always hid it under the veil of limited liability. And this is another example of where big pharma, and it's the same, doesn't matter, it's the same for bureaucrats. They don't have to be held accountable. For the same for superannuation funds, they don't have to be accountable because they risk other people's capital. And when you have situations of where you have big organisations risking other people's capital, you need proper checks and balances. And one of those things is definitely not indemnities, because indemnities effectively remove the checks and balances. Okay, the whole point of government is to protect government, or the whole point of a democracy is to protect government from the people. And it's not the other way around. I mean, we are here to protect the people. We are not here to protect the big end of town. We are not here to protect corporations, the bureaucrats, or big wealth funds who own these big corporations today. I mean, the corporations are just puppets on the string now. The puppeteers and the puppet masters are actually the superannuation funds here in Australia, or BlackRock and Vanguard overseas. And they have these cross interests that allow them to get away with lots of things. Now, the other thing that makes this indemnity particularly bad is the fact that there's been no transparency about the contract. We have on many occasions tried to get the terms and conditions of the contract with Pfizer, and it hasn't been forthcoming. So yet again, one of the bulwarks of democracy is accountability and transparency, and we have not got that. So number one, it's bad that we've been given an indemnity without knowing the risks. Number two, it's even worse that we aren't being transparent. And number three, is that I don't believe that this contract will still hold up. I was taught at university in introductory law in the bowels of the Forgan Smith building out at Queensland University that there's three elements to a contract. There's the offer, there's an acceptance, and there's terms and conditions. And the terms and conditions of this particular drug were not made available to the people. They were not made available to the people. And one of the things in the immunisation schedule that, you know, it's on the internet there, and it's basically an oral contract between the Australian government and the people, the immunisation handbook, is that people have to be fully informed about the risks of the drug before they are taking it. And of course, they weren't fully informed at all. Okay, they were lied to. They were lied to by the government, and they were lied to by Big Pharma. And you don't need to take my word for it, because right here we've got the Australian Public Assessment Report for the Pfizer vaccine. And if we turn to page, and this came out, by the way, in January 2021, so you can Google this. It's the Product Assessment Report, the Australian Public Assessment Report. If you go to page 31, you will see what they tested this on. And I'm just going to read out some of the missing information that was involved with the sale of this drug. Missing information: use in pregnancy and whilst breastfeeding, use in immunocompromised patients. Now, I wonder why they did that, and I'll tell you why this really matters, because last week I finally got the TGA to admit that myocarditis is an autoimmune disease. Okay, so they knew. So this is the thing: a normal vaccine, generates an immune response against the foreign body that's in the vaccine. This vaccine doesn't do that. This vaccine creates an autoimmune response, okay, via generating a T-cell response against the little peptides that are presented on the cell membrane. That's in the Pfizer FOI 2389-6 report, okay, that generates a T-cell response, okay? So that means you're now getting an autoimmune response against your own cells. So the pathway of this vaccine was completely different. It created an autoimmune response. And yet right here, they never actually tested the drug on immunocompromised patients. They've also avoided use, so one of the missing information is also use in frail patients with comorbidities. Well, for example, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes. Well, diabetes has jumped a lot in excess deaths. It's one of the largest contributors to excess deaths, and yet they never tested for diabetes. Chronic neurological disease and cardiovascular disorders. Is myocarditis a cardiovascular disorder? And all of this was missing information. And yet again, it's relevant because last week, Pfizer and Moderna could not explain why their vaccine causes myocarditis. Well, it turns out that they never actually tried to find out before they rolled this thing out. They were happy to say the vaccine was safe and effective, but they didn't actually understand what they were selling. And of course, we've got use in patients with autoimmune or inflammatory disorders. Wow. Interaction with other vaccines and long-term safety data. So they lied, people. They lied and people died. And yet these people were given an indemnity, okay? I've been contacted by the mother of a child this week whose child was recognised by the TGA who was offered $85,000, and that included $15,000 for funeral costs. Her daughter was worth $70,000. That is a disgrace. That is an absolute disgrace. But let's go to the actual initial reason why this was approved. And this is on page 7 of the product assessment report. And this says COVID-19 vaccine has provisional approval for the indication below. Active immunisation to prevent coronavirus disease 2019 caused by SARS-CoV-2 in individuals 16 years of age or older. This decision has been made on the basis of short-term efficacy, you're not wrong about that, and safety data, and continued approval depends on the evidence of longer-term efficacy and safety. Well, guess what? The TGA approved this, fully approved the Pfizer vaccine just last week, I think. So they're not really being held to account on what they said they do. But let's talk about the so-called efficacy and the 95% efficacy that the Pfizer originally claimed that they provided. It turns out that was all a scam because, you see, in the initial trial there were about 44,000 participants in the trial, and of the 20,000 each they ended up measuring, 162 in the non-vaccinated group caught COVID and only 8 in the vaccinated group caught COVID. That was less than 1% of the trial group in either trial. That is not statistically significant. But here's what's interesting, right, is that they excluded from this trial 1,594 people were suspected but not confirmed in the inoculation group, and 1,816 people were suspected to have COVID but not confirmed in the vaccine group. Okay, so they actually excluded 3,500 people from the actual efficacy trial. Now, the reason why they did that was that if they'd included all those people, it would have reduced the relative risk reduction to 19%, and that was below the 50% threshold necessary to get European approval for the vaccine. So they've engaged in deliberate, in my view, fraud. But you don't have to just talk about the efficacy. Let's talk about the situation with Maddie de Gary. She was one of the children who was in the children's adolescent trial, and she ended up in a wheelchair being fed through a tube. And how did Pfizer describe her injury? As a functional abdominal pain. This was a girl who developed gastroparesis, nausea, vomiting, erratic blood pressure, memory loss, brain fog, headaches, dizziness, fainting, seizures, verbal and motor tics, menstrual cycle issues, lost feeling from the waist down, hence the wheelchair, lost bowel and bladder control, and had a nastrogastric tube placed because she lost her ability to eat. She was hospitalised many times and has been wheelchair bound and fed via a tube. And how did Pfizer treat this victim of their own trial? They gaslighted her. They gaslighted her own injury. Shame on you, Pfizer. What an absolute disgrace. And we gave these people indemnity. But that's not all. Because, you see, one of the things that these people are claiming, Pfizer has claimed, is that they, it wasn't meant to stop transmission and it wasn't meant to stop efficacy. But here's the thing. If you actually look at their own trial data, they claim, so Pfizer now last week were claiming that it's going to reduce serious illness, right, and death. Well, that's not true because their own 6-month data that was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that related adverse events from Pfizer were 300% higher in the inoculation group, i.e. in the vaccine group, than in the placebo group. Any severe adverse event was 75% higher in the vaccine group than the actual placebo group. and any serious adverse event was 10% higher. So even in Pfizer's own 6-month trial data, injuries were higher, significantly higher, in the vaccine group. And yet these people still try and claim that the vaccine reduces illness. Well, I find that very hard to believe. And you don't have to just base it on a trial, because we know in 2021 that in May 2021, the number of deaths jumped by about 4% and continued to stay that high throughout the year, so that there were 172,000 deaths in 2021, all from May onwards, in the last 8 months of the year, straight after the vaccine rollout. Now, this is significant because it was before COVID was in the community. So what caused it? There was almost 10,000 more deaths in 2021 than there was in 2020. And yes, 2020 saw a reduction of 2,000 deaths from 2019, but that's a long way short of 10,000. We had 1,300 deaths from COVID in 2021, but we had 1,000 deaths in 2020. So only out of that extra 10,000 deaths, 300 was due to COVID. So what was the cause of all those other excess deaths? And why were those excess deaths in the states that were locked down? The highest jump was in Queensland and WA, where there was absolutely no COVID. Absolutely no COVID. And that figure is 3 standard deviations from the average mean of the prior 5 years. That is a sigma 6 event. That is a 1 in 1,000 chance of happening statistically. So that's an outlier of, enormous proportions. And yet these people will still sit here and claim that this vaccine reduced illness and death, and that is not true. But we can't get Pfizer's contract, but what we can get is Pfizer's set of financial accounts, and I managed to get them yesterday. You can pay $47 to ATSIC and actually get their financial accounts, because they don't just engage in deceptive conduct.
The time for debate has expired, and you'll be in continuation when we resume to the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Amendment Vaccine Indemnity Bill of 2023 at a later date.
Senator Babet, do you seek the call?
Yes, I do. I move my amendment, which has been circulated. And like a short statement, please, if that's okay.
Yes, you're entitled to.
Thank you.
5 minutes.
So earlier today, we debated in this place my private senator's bill, and what a debate it was, ladies and gents. Now, it is important that my bill is referred to the Finance and Public Administration Legislation Committee. This bill deserves due process. The elected members in this place deserve more information on the issue of indemnity. The legal and financial implications must be fully examined prior to my bill progressing to a vote. In the interest of transparency and accountability, I seek the support of everyone here in this place to refer this bill to committee. It's very important, obviously. We've seen what's happened over the last 3 years, and we've got to do our bit to set things right. Thank you.
I tend to put the question. I put the question that the motion be agreed to. Those for the question say aye. Against, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Division is required. Ring the bells. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question before the Senate is the motion moved by Senator Babet, which is an amendment to the Selection of Bills Committee report. Those for the question pass to the right of the chair, noes to the left of the chair. I appoint as teller for the aye, Senator Cadell, and appoint teller for the noes, Senator Urquhart. Honourable Senators, there being 39 ayes and 16 noes, it's resolved in the affirmative.
Brought to you by Freedom Media WA, where journalism should never be a government narrative.